So France at the end of May 1968 is in chaos. And the big question is, what is Charles de Gaulle going to do in response? On May 29th, he began secretly packing up his papers in the Élysée Palace, and had basically told one agency, to quote here, that he was leaving the palace. "I do not want to give them a chance to attack the Élysée. It would be regrettable if blood were shed in my personal defence. I decided to leave. Nobody attacks an empty palace." And to a lot of people, it seemed that de Gaulle was on the verge of resigning. He had met with Georges Pompidou. Pompidou had basically told de Gaulle, "Look, we need to call new elections." Obviously, France has fallen into chaos here. De Gaulle, as president, had the power to dissolve the National Assembly, to call for new elections, which would effectively have served as something of a referendum on the actions of the strikers in May 1968, a chance for the French people to either rally behind de Gaulle or to express their sympathy for the strikers. But de Gaulle refused. De Gaulle basically feared that would mean his party would suffer a heavy defeat. He was very, very pessimistic. And he basically told Pompidou, "Well, I decided to head off to my country retreat at Colombey, his traditional home, his home base just to the northeast of Paris." So he got in a helicopter and took off. But the kind of big scandal that emerged, or at least the chaotic moment that followed, Pompidou was shortly afterwards informed that the helicopter had not gone to Colombey. In essence, that de Gaulle had disappeared. For several hours, so the French government had released a statement earlier on saying de Gaulle was retired, or was heading to his home in Colombey. It was widely assumed by a lot of people that he was simply going there to write his resignation speech. The French government told everyone he would be back the following day, but then he simply vanished, and none of the people, the French government had no idea where he went. And so we were literally playing, instead of "Where's Waldo, where's de Gaulle?" And Pompidou and the rest of the French government had no idea. One of Pompidou himself started telling people, "I think he's fled the country." And one of Pompidou's allies gave him a gun and said, "I think you're going to need this," because it really seemed that France was on the verge of falling into chaos. And of course, a lot of people couldn't help but draw parallels with Charles X and Louis Philippe. Charles X in 1830 and Louis Philippe in 1848, the kings we saw in the 19th century who abdicated, who fled the country. It seemed that de Gaulle had done something similar, and that's certainly what Pompidou and others were beginning to think as well. Meanwhile, word of the fact that de Gaulle was so I take that back. Word of de Gaulle's absence had not gotten out, but the fact that people thought de Gaulle was out to resign brought a crowd of about 500,000 out onto the streets in Paris on May 30th, 1968. Chanting "Adieu de Gaulle," "Goodbye de Gaulle," and calling for reform and revolution. And a lot of people, the French government, the French police, suspected that this crowd, in which communists and socialists played a prominent role, were about to attempt to stage a coup. So it literally seemed that de Gaulle is missing. There's a large crowd on the streets of Paris, and it looks like revolution might take place that day, something along the lines of what we saw happen in Paris in 1830 and again in 1848. And afterwards, actually, and so long story short, that moment of revolution doesn't come. The protesters do not try and occupy any buildings. Afterwards, people were asked if they had seized power, what would the reaction have been? 20% of the French people said they would have supported it, 23% said they would have opposed it, and 57% said they wouldn't have interfered either way. So France, seemingly in the middle of the day in May 30th, 1938, is somewhat listless. The question, of course, is where exactly had de Gaulle gone? Well, de Gaulle had gone to Germany. Specifically, he had gone to Baden-Baden, which you can see from this map here is just over the border in Germany. That was the base of the French army occupying, or I guess, that was based in Germany. There was still American, British, and French units in West Germany. Baden-Baden was where the French army was based, and the man in the picture here was General Jacques Massu, who was in charge of the French forces there, and generally was considered to be the most kind of respected general in the French army. Now, de Gaulle and Massu did not have a great history. De Gaulle had actually removed Massu from his position of command in Algeria in 1960 when he had criticised de Gaulle's policies there. And basically, and also it should be stressed that it was not until really years later people became aware that de Gaulle went to Baden-Baden. And so much of what I'm about to tell you is kind of stuff that historians found out later on, especially when Massou himself was interviewed years later about the events. According to Massou, de Gaulle basically showed up, had essentially given up on the French presidency, and in fact was really in Baden-Baden to kind of secure his life in person in order to be protected from what he feared might be an angry mob. He had gone to Baden-Baden for protection. But Massou, so Massou tells a story, gave him encouragement, said, look, the French army is still behind you 100%. Massou said, I don't think most French people support these strikes, and therefore it would be a mistake to give into them and resign. That's exactly what they want. And I will promise you the full backing of the French army. In other words, that if you do need to call in the army to suppress these strikes by force, the French army will be willing to do so. However, Massou wanted something in exchange. In particular, what he wanted was a pardon for all the members of the secret army organization, the OAS, that had tried to assassinate de Gaulle in the early 1960s. So that's just from cartoon is referring to these attempts to assassinate de Gaulle. And apparently that was part of the unsigned spoken verbal agreement that de Gaulle made with Massou. So knowing that he had now the backing of the army, de Gaulle returns to France on May 30th, heads directly to Paris, and possibly with the idea in the back of his mind that if we need to bring in soldiers, I can do so and I can suppress the strikes that way. But he decides to try and go the political route first. He gives a televised speech, basically insisting he is not going to resign. In fact, announcing that there will now be elections in the following month. He's going to dissolve the National Assembly, hold elections, which, as I mentioned earlier on, would act as a de facto referendum on the strikes themselves. And his most famous comment was, in the course of the speech, was he was willing to accept change. So reform, yes. Chaos, no. So Chien-let, chaos, no. But actually, what de Gaulle was doing, there's kind of a pun on the word Chien-let, because it sounds a lot like the French word for shit in bed. There you go. And as college students, you guys have seen much worse than that, so don't be put off by the image. But basically, kind of his way of kind of casting, in kind of crude terms, rejecting the demands of the protesters and kind of suggesting that, yeah, this is kind of a reforms that most people simply don't want, or at least the kind of vague demands of the protesters don't really make sense. So, as I said, elections are going to be called, and he then called from the ordinary people of France who support his policies to make themselves heard. And so that afternoon, we had a march in the earlier part of the day where protesters were calling for de Gaulle to resign. But after de Gaulle's speech, made at around 2 p.m. that day, there was a huge rally of Gaulle supporters, the Gaulle supporters in Paris, numbering up to about 800,000. So actually more of those took part in that protest than the earlier protest. Sorry, this is more took part in the support rally than the anti-de Gaulle protest earlier on. And that was a clear sign to de Gaulle that he'd been correct, that there were a lot of people who actually still supported him. And the effect of his announcement was to essentially deflate the balloon of revolution. That by offering a referendum, a de facto referendum, by offering elections, de Gaulle was opening the door for if people say they want change, then let the people decide what kind of change they want. The campaign for the legislative election was led by Pompidou. One of Pompidou's phrases was, and this is from a Richard Nixon comment, but actually Pompidou used it first, it's time for the great silent majority to stand up and be spoken. So we have protesters in France, but Pompidou is saying that these are loud, unrepresentative voices of a minority of French people. Now it's time for the real French people to emerge. Pompidou's campaign also placed heavy emphasis on the kind of radical nature of the protesters, the old Red Menace. This is essentially a communist takeover. And the French Socialists and Communist Party themselves were not really willing to cooperate or synchronize their electoral efforts. And the result, effectively, was, so the elections were held on June 23rd, so less than a month after the Gaulle speech. The result was, if you get the pun, a landslide in favour of de Gaulle's party. Let's take a look at the actual figures here. So actually, an enormous majority returned for the president's party. This was the biggest victory of conservative forces in France since the Bloc National of 1919. So a kind of a thorough defeat for the French left, and really a rejection at the ballot box by a vast majority of French voters for the kind of radical demands for change and revolution that the strikers seem to have brought about. So in the short term, certainly this was a defeat for the French left and for those who wanted reform and change. But in some ways, May 1968 was to remain a rallying cry on the French left, certainly to introduce a whole new generation to radical left politics, and to demand for kind of greater political change. And eventually we're going to see that the French Socialist Party, within about a decade, is going to emerge as the largest political party in France. So after that, many of those people who took part in those events were known as 68ers, in some ways like the old people who participated in the gold rush strikes or the gold rush in West Coast United States in the 1840s, the 49ers. In France, they were the 68ers who participated in the kind of heady month of revolution, where it very much seemed a dramatic change was possible. And this generation was to go on to have a substantial influence in French politics over the next 15 and 20 years.